Having training accredited identifies the gold standard, if you will. It's an outside person has come in and audited that training organization's testing and said it meets the stated objectives of the JPRs, but also it has the rigor of an administrative process and a testing process that indicates it's credible, and they accredit that organization's test to that specific standard, so an individual can claim that they're certified to an NFPA professional qualification standard. One of the things that sometimes in training we tend to forget about is experience, and we're going to talk, when we show you a couple of our illustrations, how we're trying to evolve the use of immersive learning technologies for training from not only the novice, but also to the experienced firefighter. And how do you regard experience in this pathway? Because when you start your fire service career as a novice, you have a high degree for knowledge with low experience, but when you're at the further end of your fire service career pathway and you have high experience, how do you leverage that in a learning environment with immersive learning technologies? Training is what we do. How can we do that in a safe, effective, and sets and rep manner? And lastly, education. So that's the formal process of education that you can get through a higher institution, a university, or a technical school to complement what we're providing at the fire service. So it's our observation that those 8 elements are the ecosystem that need to come together. Well, they do exist, but as a cog, how do we integrate them to work seamlessly, and how can immersive learning technologies be an enabler to bring them together, but also ensure that we're getting the learner the right information they need. On this illustration, what we would like to illustrate is where we were with file and how we've progressed to train. And Casey and I were joking this morning that the train is coming. The train has left the station. We have seen the rapid expansion of tools that are technology-based, and certainly AI, from something that 5 years ago might have been seen as, oh, that's interesting, and now it's like you can't go a day without somebody talking about AI in an application, or it popping up in your Word document saying, hey, Copilot here wants to help you, or if you're doing a Google search or whatnot. So that's just a illustration of how technology is rapidly evolving. With File, we were looking at immersive learning in the visualization. In that project, we were talking about what's the future look like. We were identifying immersive learning as the right to fail safely. That was kind of a high-level objective that we wanted to say, you know what? If we can visualize immersive learning as a tool, but let the student have the opportunity to fail safely and to learn from that, and Jim mentioned that in his opening remarks about the need for having good after-action reviews and looking at performance and reviewing it to better performance. We talked about that. And of course, we wanted to have productive engagement. How do we take technology and enable productive engagement? What that really refers to is the dialogue between the technology providers and the fire service as a consumer. And Casey mentioned that we want to get everybody to come together, because I've been involved with some technology developers as they have developed immersive learning tools, and we were talking past each other. We found that their words were different than my words. Well, the same words, different meanings. Their understanding of what the fire service did, how it looked, and how it behaved was very different than mine. And when they code things to make it look like what they think the fire service is, you're looking at it going, nah, that ain't us. Wrong colored hat, wrong colored shoes, whatever. There's a need to have a dialogue where you're both talking to each other in a productive manner so that the technology provider can deliver what is needed and the fire service can get what it wants. So that's productive engagement. Improving the quality of training, and Jim listed a variety of things that immersive learning tools and technologies can provide. Creating interest. When we were out in Utah, we had a really great experience with our focus group, and we got a lot from that. And we asked the question of the focus group, what can we do to make immersive learning more engaging and whatnot? The simple answer from one recruit firefighter, make it fun. Make it fun. Create an engagement. Now, I'm not saying we're making it fun to the point that learning's not taking place, but understand, we are talking about humans here. We are talking about people who want to be engaged. We have to connect to that. So always remember, these products are designed to help a human. And how do we always consider how humans behave and what their needs are? And lastly, as Casey mentioned and Jim mentioned, it's not to replace hands-on experience, but how can we use it to supplement hands-on experience? So it's seen as complementary. How is that interface going to happen between the theoretical and the technology-based tool and the real-world application that can be easily recreated to provide those sets and reps? But more importantly, for the fire service to walk away and say, that experience was great. The same way they feel when they walk out of a live fire experience in an NFPA 1403 qualified live fire training instructor, where they're high-fiving and they're fist bumping and they're pumped up and this is their job and they want to do this every day of their life. How can we get to that level of engagement, that level of satisfaction, that level of credibility of immersive learning technology? So what we set out to do was to evaluate the application of ILT. We took a couple of specific user cases, again, to make it more physical, if you will. Fire apparatus, driver operator, pumper, immersive learning tools, highway incident command training. We did focus on the fire apparatus, driver operator training in the pump operations, immersive learning tools. The highway incident command training, we do not have a rubric for that yet. We found so much to talk about and to do and to work on those first two. We decided to really give attention to those and learn from those, and then build out that third one as time goes. Develop and validate an evaluation tool to assess the training tools, which is the conformity assessment framework. The deliverables, the rubric, the conformity assessment guidebook, and the summit. So this summit is one of our deliverables. And this is just to show you the connection between the FILE project and the TRAIN project. So on the left, the FILE roadmap listed these 6 recommendations that needs to be done to further promote the development of immersive learning tools and technologies. And if you go across everything that's marked in TRAIN, that's this project and what it's done to align with the roadmap. We completed a survey. We did the conformity assessment framework. We worked on the rubric, and we're having the summit. And you can see those all have achieved the objectives of increased networking, maintaining a focused analysis of the needs of the fire service and technology developers, having an evaluation tool to further the dialogue, examining the training ecosystem, who are the players and how does immersive learning integrate with them, talking about the role of standards and how do we interact and connect to the standards with these, and lastly, maintaining a high level of outreach by bringing folks together for networking and building the relationships. Any questions about TRAIN? The train has left the station. You are now on board, and we're going to take you to the next stop. But before I do, Casey?
Well, I'm just going to say that per our agenda, we are a little behind, but we built in extra time, so that's a non-issue. Don't worry, you still have a lunch, you'll still have break, and so forth. But I do want to say we're about to take a deeper dive into what our deliverables really are. We need you to really absorb this and get on the train, because it's moving. And we have deliverables that are coming out of this project, but we're going to hear next about the Kapalo rubrics, among other details that Kate is going to provide us with here now. So as we pull that up.
Casey,
yes?
quick question. NFPA, intent to be global or North American focused? Or what
NFPA, so, okay, I'll go back to my 3.5 decades at NFPA. NFPA has no geographic boundaries, and it's an unusual thing. And this is where, as I would travel around the world for NFPA, back when I was before I retired from NFPA, it didn't matter if I was in Wales or if I was in Australia or anywhere, Kuwait, Egypt. I think of all the places I got to travel around the world. So that's the unusual thing about NFPA. However, we've evolved here with roots in North America, so the heaviest influence is through North America. But NFPA has never had geographic boundaries since it was founded in 1896. And there were, the earliest members were actually from whatever it was called before it became Stalingrad or whatever in Russia. It was one of the first international members back 120 something years ago. So, you know, that's the unusual thing with NFPA.
So NFPA develops standards, codes, and regulation that cover a variety of the built infrastructure, the electrical code, the plumbing code, the life safety code, the job performance, the JPRs, professional qualification standards for firefighter training. They're available globally, but I believe what's occurred is nations have gone on their own path with their own fire services to develop their own standards and protocols. If there's what's in the offing? Under Dr. Lori Moore Merrill, the U.S. stood up the first World Fire Congress, bringing together representatives of some 60 some odd nations, I believe, to talk about their needs as fire services. And certainly they talked about the life safety codes, the building codes. Training was added at the discussion. That was a universal item from all of the participants. So the World Fire Congress has stood up task groups, and I'm chairing the World Fire Congress task group, and Craig is my co-chair, and we're looking at training and education for the fire services, and we're going to start talking about where are you getting your standards from? How are you doing it? Now, is this going to come together, and are we going to have a merging or consolidation? I don't know, but certainly we're going to be sharing information and seeing how we align and seeing what the gaps are, but more importantly, seeing what can we share to both improve, to all improve our situation. So it's very country-centric right now, but I'm hoping that through the World Fire Congress, we're going to expand the discussion.
All set?
I think so. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I just want to say a special shout out thank you to IFSI for hosting and keeping us here and having us. I think it's really important to kind of talk through some of the background and context behind where all of this kind of started. You've heard from Ken and Casey about the overall project goals and kind of how this all has come to be, but I think, you know, kind of diving a little bit deeper down might be a little bit helpful, give you more context as you kind of think through these ideas and concepts throughout the next day or so. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Kate. I am working with the Fire Protection Research Foundation on this project. I have a background in human factors, but I just kind of want to tell a quick story because, you know, in the fire service we love stories. So I did my PhD at UCF under Joe Laviola. And the reason that that's significant is in academia, kind of like the fire service, we have these different kind of lineages, right? So Joe actually was a student of Andy, who was at Brown University and who the character Toy Story Andy is named after. And so when we think through some of these things that we're doing in the fire service, I think we can all kind of center on somebody who's been a good mentor to us or someone who's been important and influential in our work. And so when I think through this, you can actually see in a couple of the different films, there's a book on the shelf that's computer applications. They're all nods to Andy. And so throughout this, I kind of just wanted to put that at the center because I think, you know, we have to remember our why. Why are we doing this? We're doing this to save firefighters' lives. We're doing this to make training better. We're doing this to enhance our industry. And so this is, you know, this is the origin story of Kate Kapalo. So when we think through immersive learning and what that means in the fire service, we've talked extensively about this. This group knows about this. I'm not going to belabor all of the details of my bio or how this all came to be. But really the thing that I want to hammer home here is that we have to train like we fight, right? If we're using simulation, if we're using immersive learning and it's not giving us the time pressure, it's not putting us under cognitive stress, it's not putting us under physical stress, we're not necessarily reaching the training outcomes that we need to reach. And so that's really where the goal of this project kind of develops is how do we get to training like we need to train? How do we fight like we need to fight? And that's because failure is fatal here. We don't have the opportunity to make mistakes in our real world firefighting situations. And when we kind of look through all of these line of duty deaths, when we look through these injuries, there's a lot of common things that stick out to us, and that's really the root of human factors, is how do we look at what impacts us and our performance to be able to do our best. So I'm gonna play this quick video. Is this gonna work? Okay. Well, we'll circle back to this, but essentially what I wanted to do is to show you Meta. Actually, I worked for Meta for a little bit as a user experience researcher, and they had this video that came out that looked at AR and VR and how we could use that in the fire service. And really that was kind of this idea of inducing that time pressure, inducing that cognitive load. But I think one of the challenges when we think about immersive learning is we start with the hardest use case in the fire service, right? We tend to start with a structure fire and a residential structure, and we kind of go from there. And I think one of the hard pieces, or the things that we have to challenge ourselves to ask right now, is when does simulation make sense? So the military has built out extensive pipelines for how we train. We don't put people in cockpits right away. We don't put baby pilots in the cockpit and just say, fly, figure it out. We have a systematic training process, a pipeline for how we do that. And that's really what this Project Train is focused on, is where does immersive learning make sense? How can we implement things from other domains to get us to where we need to go? And so one kind of anecdote or thing that I wanted to touch on is the history of crew resource management, because I think this is one of the perfect examples when we think about cross-domain or parallel professions. How has this influenced the fire service, and how is it adopted today? Well, crew resource management, for a few of you, this will be a review, but it really started with Flight 173 in 1978. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of plane crashes right now. It's heightened in the media. In DC, we've been dealing with the Potomac recent collision. And so when we look at some of the challenges, human factor scientists worked with NASA, we worked with the Air Force, we all came together and we decided, okay, what's happening here? What's going on with this incident? What could we do better to prevent this from happening? And that's really when NASA started kind of developing crew resource management. We implemented it into aviation, and now it's used in the fire service. It's widely adopted. So kind of historically speaking, in the early 2000s, really, Wildland, I know for the structural folks in the room, you might get a little bit antsy, but Wildland has been doing this for a long time. They've been implementing human factors for a long time. They've been thinking through all these challenges, so shout out to our Wildland folks who really understand this and have implemented it, but it has been adopted widely in the fire service. And so really when we look at after-action reviews, to Director Keegan's point, and the briefing, so LCES, lookouts, all of these things implement different aspects of crew resource management. And this is widely adopted on the fire ground and on the fire line. This is also true for healthcare. So surgeons use checklists. We have crew resource management in surgical theaters, and in the ER, we do this all the time. So this is just another example of how this one kind of concept coming from aviation has been widely adopted across multiple industries. And so when we think about what does it mean to be cross-domain, what does it mean in high-stakes environments, this is really where it began, crew resource management. But the one thing that I wanted to point out here and kind of translate for us historically speaking, or kind of put into context here, is that really what we're trying to do with immersive learning is take that rehearsal piece. So take the fire ground or the kitchen table, for example. You're sitting around the kitchen table, that's a big, we call them sitting rooms in DC, but whatever you want to call them in your fire service. We talk about things. We talk about what happened on the fire ground. We talk about what went well. We talk about hot washes. We do all these different things. And we talk through these stories because stories are how humans kind of make sense of things. And really that serves a purpose as kind of a mental simulation. We're able to talk through, okay, this went well, this didn't go well, or in my career at this point, I had been faced with this decision. And that's where some of that heart and that tradition gets passed down. And I think that's an important piece to kind of highlight here, because even when we're talking about, the most amazing technologies, it all really starts with a story at the kitchen table. And so when we think through, how are we rehearsing these things? How are we thinking about reality? How are we implementing that into simulation? This is kind of the birth of that. So when we look at what is most important, it's being able to rehearse these critical skills in a way that doesn't cost people their lives. We also, as I mentioned, we've already kind of talked about this, but really what I want to hammer home here is that if we're measuring the right things, then we're actually able to show transfer of training. And I think that's a piece that we've kind of gotten away from, or not necessarily fully fleshed out in the fire service. And I will talk through a few of these things. I know you'll hear from Chief Oates later a little bit, and from Chief Chenworth on some of these pieces. But really, the key to this is if we're measuring what matters, then we're able to show transfer of training, and that's what we're ultimately goaling ourselves for on this training project. So how did we kind of do this? What are the steps that we're taking? You've heard from the general framework, but I'm gonna break down kind of what my role is on this project and how we've kind of thought through it. So if you're a scientist, you generally need to do a needs assessment. Like, what kind of scientist are you if you don't do that, right? So we started with looking at the literature, parallel professions. My background is in human factors, as I mentioned, but I started working with FATD pilots at the beginning of my career in decision making, and kind of looking at all of that. So based on that, we pull all these different parallel professions together, and we start to look at, okay, what has worked in some of these industries and what hasn't for immersive learning. Then we did a survey. So thank you to those of you that filled that out. It was really helpful. I'm gonna go through some of those results, and we'll talk about what that means and how that kind of fed into this project. Then we'll talk about the rubrics a little bit. I promise I won't bore you to tears. You'll have opportunities to work with these throughout the day today and tomorrow. And then the conformity assessment framework, that piece is Casey and Ken's really kind of understanding of how are we implementing this all into a cohesive framework so that it makes sense and we can actually use this. Because these rubrics, while they're helpful standalone, they actually feed into a greater goal, which is how do we get to where we need to be? So let's talk about the survey. So we gave the survey to all of the state training directors, and we asked you all to fill this out as part of a way to gather information about what's going on at different state training academies, what are instructors doing, where are things going, where are you at right now, and where do you want to be? So one of the things that we asked is, where would you prefer to be using immersive learning? And a lot of people indicated incident command, and you'll hear from Chief Chenworth a little bit later. In DC, we are really big on using simulation and immersive learning for incident command. But I found this to be really interesting because I think this is a clue. This is our roadmap for where do we want to go? Where does immersive learning make sense? You all intuitively kind of know where it makes sense, right, based on your expertise and where you are. But I think it's also kind of telling in the sense that there's opportunities that we need to explore throughout all these different areas, and we can't explore them all at once, which is why we're breaking these down into a couple of different scenarios, but I think this helps us kind of point our compass to where we need to be. Then we've got looking at barriers, and this part is really interesting because I'm interested, and I think a lot of you are, in technology adoption in the fire service. And we always hear, people in the fire service, the two things that firefighters hate are the way things are and change. And I mean, that's just people in general. We all hate change. And I think to get to where we need to go, we have to understand what are the things that are causing us issues, what are these obstacles. From your perspective, you see a lot in your roles. What's challenging? What do you see versus what's being communicated as the narrative, right? And I think this is pretty telling because we're seeing a pretty interesting kind of diffusion of this across all different buckets, and we'll dive into this in just a second, but we looked at technology, we looked at process, we looked at administration, organizational change, and adoption itself. And as you can see from this, it's almost equally distributed. So we're looking at this, there's a lot of obstacles, but we need to delve more into what exactly do these obstacles pose for us? What does that mean? How do we get to where we need to be with immersive learning if these are the problems? So we broke this down because it's a small sample size. I wanted you to be able to see kind of where things are going. So the majority actually ranked the #1 barrier as technology, which I think is interesting because if we're kind of thinking about this, when you delve into the survey results, it kind of comes out that it may not necessarily be technology, but it's the process for implementing the technology or the challenges of talking to city council and getting the right budget. Those are all different things that play a role in this. So this also includes things like, are you able to evaluate the technology critically? Do you have the time to do that? A lot of state training directors don't. Administration or local government, as I mentioned, this was kind of shocking to me because only 10 out of our 48 respondents found that to be really kind of a problem. It's kind of equally distributed there, but And then organizational change was a big one. That was kind of, we weren't all consistent in how we rated that. It was kind of across the board. And then the adoption piece is really interesting to me too down here, because if you look at the breakdown, we're kind of all over the place in terms of whether or not we think that this is a problem for us. So when we categorize adoption, we defined it as a willingness of staff to embrace new instructional technologies. And I think throughout the next 2 days, we'll find out that that might not be necessarily how we're all looking at adoption, right? And then this is also interesting as well. So I wanted to understand, if you're looking at a new training technology, what are the most important things for you to think about? And effectiveness went out, no question. And so that's the whole point of